Medal of Honor, a series that has forever changed the way first-person shooters are made. When the franchise debuted in 1999, no other action game had managed to successfully capture the intensity of the Second World War for which Medal of Honor is now famous. Its cinematic scope was a breath of fresh air in a crowded market of formulaic shooters, and it quickly became the design template that many other developers would base their games upon. Even if you've never played a Medal of Honor game, you've certainly felt the repercussions of the iconic series. But what happened to EA's once great property? The franchise that formerly saw massive worldwide success with games that kept raising the bar for other first-person shooters hasn't seen a release since 2012. To answer this question, we will not only cover the story behind the series' rise to prominence and ultimate downfall, but also provide a comprehensive overview of all the Medal of Honor games that have and haven't seen the light of day.
Tommy! I'll see you on the beach!
How old are you, by the way? I'm 41 years old today. Today I am 41 years old. Today I am a man.
The idea that would eventually spark Medal of Honor's creation came in 1997. At the time, Steven Spielberg's motion picture Saving Private Ryan was less than 1 year away from being theatrically released. However, knowing that his R-rated film wouldn't connect with younger audiences, the director turned to the developers of his own studio, DreamWorks Interactive, and asked them to create a game that would not only deliver exciting over-the-top set pieces, but also educate a new generation of gamers about the horrific events that transpired in the Second World War. The idea was met with little enthusiasm from the studio's corporate management, who believed that Medal of Honor would be a tough sell in a market dominated by futuristic action shooters. A small group of developers within the company spent an entire week creating a proof-of-concept demo that would eventually help Spielberg's game receive the green light to start production. Medal of Honor was only a couple of months in development when the first problems started to arise. Captain Dale Dye, who was asked to join the team as a military advisor, initially believed that they were creating an exploitative, tone-deaf, irresponsible thing. Once the developers managed to convince him of their honorable intentions, his mood softened, and he agreed to assist in the game's production. Dedicated to making Medal of Honor as authentic as possible, Dye ran the team through an impromptu boot camp, helped them rectify the campaign's historical inaccuracies, and even narrated its opening sequence. The hard work and attention to detail paid off. When an early build of the game was sent to publisher Electronic Arts, it was passed around the office all weekend, and the company was quick to sign DreamWorks Interactive up to its partners program. In 1999, when Medal of Honor was entering its final stages of development, Paul Buca of the Congressional Medal of Honor Society attempted to convince Steven Spielberg that his company shouldn't release the title, that it was offensive to war veterans to make a game based on their experiences. However, after seeing the respect the game had for its subject matter, Buca relented and even agreed to endorse it. Had this conversation ended differently, Medal of Honor may have ended up never seeing the light of day. The game was released to acclaim from fans and critics alike, with much of the praise directed towards its presentation and sense of historical authenticity. It was every bit as engaging in the gameplay department as it was informative in its narrative, offering bite-sized history lessons in the form of text logs and video clips in between missions. The developers managed to squeeze every drop of power out of the original PlayStation, with the game sporting character models that consisted of 250 polygons and a cutting-edge hierarchical animation system that blew the 2-megabyte memory budget of the aging console's hardware. While the graphics and sound of the game are dated by today's standards, its realism in the World War II shooter arena was unprecedented at the time. Medal of Honor's multiplayer mode was just a simple split-screen experience for 2 players, but this would be expanded upon in future releases. Still, the series' focus was on its single-player aspect, and it would stay this way for the duration of the franchise's lifespan. The success of Medal of Honor was immediate and far-reaching, spawning a successful franchise that would continue to connect with its target audience for at least a decade. The game's follow-up, while neither as acclaimed nor as iconic as the original release, nonetheless was an ambitious attempt at depicting one of the lesser-known settings of the Second World War, the underground French resistance against Nazi occupation. Medal of Honor Underground focused heavily on the development of its main character, Mano Baptiste. Although future releases would grow increasingly heavy in the action department, Underground was a far more personal, intimate experience for the player. The strong emphasis on historical accuracy was left by the wayside this time around. While the game featured fairly believable missions most of the time, a number of levels pitted the player against hordes of sword-toting knights in a Nazi-occupied castle. Pushing the PlayStation to its absolute limits, the developers managed to carefully balance every department of the studio's contribution with the console's memory budget and got in as much as they could to make the levels look, sound, and play great. The team pioneered an innovative system that streamed both audio as well as geometry from the disc in real time, allowing them to create massively large worlds without crashing the game. Underground was met with positive reviews, and its commercial success confirmed that Medal of Honor was a franchise with staying power. While DreamWorks Interactive was gearing up for the next generation of console hardware, Electronic Arts made the decision to change the studio's name to EA Los Angeles. The team would focus mainly on creating new entries in the Medal of Honor franchise from that point forward. 2 years later, a Game Boy Advance version of Underground made by Rebellion Developments was also released. While it was praised for its attempt to translate the first-person shooter action of its PlayStation cousin to a handheld device, the clunky controls, slow frame rate, and subpar graphics ultimately made the game a forgettable experience.
This is Torpedo 8. We spotted enemy carriers. Beginning attack run.
After the release of Underground, EA began experimenting with different directions to take the series in, and settled on a flight simulator called Fighter Command. The game would have focused on action-packed dogfights and bombing runs, giving players the ability to choose their aircraft before the start of each mission and plan their strategies accordingly. Eventually, EA canceled the game, deciding to keep the series centered around first-person shooter games. However, the concepts behind Fighter Command were salvaged and eventually found their way to LucasArts' combat simulator, Secret Weapons over Normandy. The influence of the Medal of Honor series remained apparent in that game, with a focus on high production values, a strong story, and excellent music.
Stay tight, we're almost there. Get ready to release. On my...
In May of 2000, Spielberg reached out to a small up-and-coming studio by the name of 2015 and asked its founder, Tom Kudirka, if his developers would be interested in making a PC-exclusive entry in the Medal of Honor franchise. The team who, up until then, had only developed an expansion pack for Sin, would design the game over the course of 2 years, ship it to Electronic Arts, and witness a sensation. The franchise hit the big time with Medal of Honor Allied Assault, featuring a memorable invasion on the beaches of Normandy that rivaled big-screen epics like Spielberg's own Saving Private Ryan. Allied Assault took the series to the next level.
Clear the shingle!
If Medal of Honor made a name for the franchise, Allied Assault created the market for World War II shooters and legitimized games by and large as a storytelling medium. While moviegoers could watch the Allied beach landings from the comfort of their living room, gamers could get a taste of what it was like to charge those bunkers on the 6th of June in 1944. Although explosive missions such as Operation Overlord delivered a large part of the game's action, the stealth levels were no slouch either. A good portion of the campaign was set deep behind enemy lines, with one of the most notable missions taking place in a German submarine base, where the player has to sneak past guards using stolen identity papers. These moments of nail-biting tension, coupled with a plethora of standout scripted events, succeeded in making the game's single-player campaign a diverse and memorable experience from start to finish. All this was powered by 2015's heavily modified id Tech 3 engine, which featured support for flexible animations and a complex shader system. Character models were brought to life in excruciating detail, allowing the player to easily discern the enemy's facial expressions as well as their primary and secondary weapons from a distance. No longer was the franchise held back by the first PlayStation's outdated hardware. For the first time, the franchise got serious in the multiplayer arena, which featured several spins on classic online deathmatches. It became a fan favorite on the PC and even received some mod support from the online community. While single player was still the series' selling point, Allied Assault showed the potential for a market of online war shooters. The game even spawned 2 expansion packs. Spearhead takes place in the final years of the Second World War, with the main character, Jack Barnes, fighting his way to Berlin, while Breakthrough covers the Battle of Kasserine Pass, followed by a number of missions set in Italy. Even though the campaigns in each expansion weren't quite as long and involved as the base game, they were just as action-packed, following the same successful formula as Allied Assault. The game and its expansions set the tone for World War II shooters as a whole for the next decade, showing everything a video game could accomplish in faithful retellings of the war. While it retained vestiges of 90s shooters like health packs and bullet sponge enemies, it still created a fantastic illusion of actually being on the beaches of Normandy and fighting through occupied France. This was the template Medal of Honor's competitors would copy again and again as the war for the World War II shooter market began to heat up. In 2015's Allied Assault was selling thousands of copies on PC and was hailed as one of the best shooters of its age, but console gamers would have to wait a little while longer for EALA's next entry in the franchise. While Allied Assault puts players in the shoes of U.S. Army Ranger Mike Powell, Medal of Honor Frontline tells the story of Lieutenant Jimmy Patterson, who's tasked with stealing a prototype German jet fighter. The campaign took the player through a wide variety of environments, ranging from the French countryside to the heart of Germany itself. Although Frontline shared a few elements with its PC counterpart, the campaign and mission elements were completely different, with the only real similarities being the Omaha Beach landing mission and some of the animations and textures. EALA pulled out all the stops to make the game a worthwhile experience on the 6th generation of consoles. It featured breathtaking graphics and sound for its day, with a symphonic score composed by Michael Giacchino that highlighted its intense action sequences. The game was second to none in the sound and presentation departments and did a good job of telling the story of ordinary soldiers facing extraordinary odds. The tense and hopeless atmosphere of Frontline's levels created a convincing backdrop for the AI and engaging gunplay to keep the player on the edge of their seat. However, with Allied Assault having been released just a couple of months prior, the game had a tough act to follow, and as a consequence, Frontline wasn't met with the same acclaim as its PC cousin, or some of Medal of Honor's previous releases. The franchise was starting to show a few cracks. EA Los Angeles would spend the rest of the series' lifespan struggling to evolve it in new directions. The time was ripe for a competitor to challenge Medal of Honor's place as king of the World War II shooter. Some of the developers who had worked on Allied Assault decided to leave 2015 out of a desire to operate under new management. They formed a different team, which would later be known as Infinity Ward, and work was started on a new Medal of Honor game. But when EA made the decision to take production of the series in-house, the developers were left without work and funds to keep their newly formed company afloat. After sending out a signal to all the major publishers in the industry, the team received an offer from Activision. The company would purchase Infinity Ward for $3 million and fund one of their projects for over a year, if they agreed to sign that day. Codenaming their new shooter Medal of Honor Killer, the developers decided to play to their strengths and return to the World War II setting once more. Thus, Call of Duty was born, and it would prove to be a thorn in the side of EA's franchise for years to come. Featuring the same action-packed gameplay of Medal of Honor with a fresh coat of paint and many new features that the original series was lacking, Call of Duty began to steal the spotlight from EA's franchise. With a new dynamic squad AI system, the stories of lone wolf protagonists were traded in for a series of missions that emphasized the sacrifices of war made by the game's 3 main characters and their brothers in arms. Its robust multiplayer component would dominate the online shooter scene, and features that later became staples, like the ability to aim down sights and the inclusion of a kill cam, added up to an amazing package. Call of Duty was a force to be reckoned with, and it would ultimately prove to play a major part in the fall of Medal of Honor. Up until then, the Medal of Honor franchise was going strong. The core entries were, for the most part, very well received by the public, and it didn't seem like the series would decline in quality or popularity anytime soon. Medal of Honor: Rising Sun was an ambitious game that attempted to port the series' patented focus on frenetic action sequences to the other side of the globe, sending players through famous parts of the conflict, like the Pearl Harbor attack, the Battle of Guadalcanal, and operations in Burma and Thailand. Unfortunately, it couldn't quite live up to its lofty goals. While many of the scripted events were mind-blowing for their day, the gameplay of the Medal of Honor franchise was starting to get a little long in the tooth. Levels were still mostly linear in nature, and it often felt more like a shooter out of the 90s than a modern one. Despite the game's explosive opening level, the rest of the campaign struggled to keep the player engaged. An overall lack of polish, as well as an abundance of bugs and glitches in the single player, contributed to the suspicion that Rising Sun may have been rushed to coincide with the holiday sales season. The PlayStation 2 version of the game did feature an enjoyable 8-player online multiplayer component, with the Xbox and GameCube counterparts offering local 4-player competitive modes respectively. Even though it was a fun diversion, Rising Sun's multiplayer did little to stand out and lacked the basic extensive gameplay options found in other shooters at the time. In spite of its weaknesses, Rising Sun showed that the formula had potential in the Pacific Theater and beyond. However, in order to impress their increasingly demanding fanbase, EALA's next game would have to offer more than a mere change in scenery. There was a sequel planned for Rising Sun that would have followed the protagonist of the original game's brother. It was cancelled early on after the first game received negative reviews, and EA attempted to regroup and take the series in a new direction. Fans wanting to find out what happened to Corporal Gerald Griffin's brother Donnie would get some kind of closure in the future with Medal of Honor Heroes. Less a core Medal of Honor game and more a spin-off, Infiltrator brought the series' action to the Game Boy Advance for the second time. The game was far more focused than the earlier Underground release, allowing players to take on the Axis powers through several areas in both top-down 2D levels and on-rails first-person shooter modes. Despite not being more than a footnote in the annals of gaming history today, Infiltrator was still a welcome diversion for owners of the Game Boy Advance. While Rising Sun had middling success in bringing the war against Japan to consoles, EA Los Angeles was hard at work developing Pacific Assault for the PC. Harnessing advanced computer hardware, it was able to more fully realize the vision of the Pacific Theater in a Medal of Honor game. From the frantic attack on Pearl Harbor to ground assaults on islands throughout the Pacific Ocean, the game was a return to form for the series, bringing its astounding visuals, tightly scripted action set pieces, and moving orchestrated scores to bear on the other half of the Second World War. As with previous games, developers were careful to consult with first-hand sources and historians on various game details, from gun designs to sounds and environmental accuracy. There were some indications that EALA was borrowing elements from Medal of Honor's rival in an attempt to stay relevant and win back some market share. Much like Call of Duty, the game underlined squad-based combat, although in a much more fleshed-out form, allowing the player to give basic commands to teammates and replenish their health by signaling the corpsmen. Iron sights were introduced to the series, and the emphasis was placed on frontline combat rather than covert operations taking place deep behind enemy lines. Development of the game's multiplayer component was helmed by TKO Software, who had created Allied Assault's Breakthrough expansion 1 year prior. Pacific Assault was praised for its excellent online action. The new Invader mode, which delivered intense and complex objective-based battles, was a welcome change of pace from the traditional death matches seen in the game's contemporaries. However, it ultimately wasn't enough to keep players engaged for long. Pacific Assault's servers quickly died out, and it was almost impossible to find an active match just 2 months after its release. Nonetheless, the game was an important step for the series. In a way, it showed that the campaign formula of Medal of Honor still had life in it, and that the franchise was not about to go down without a fight.
Oh, you better hope I don't catch you, Sullivan!
Hell, at least we're going in style. Nothing beats a ride in a Dauntless.
With Medal of Honor European Assault, EALA decided to ditch the linear design philosophy of games past and opted for more open-ended levels. Each mission included a number of primary as well as secondary objectives, and it was up to the player to choose what order they would be completed in. The cinematic focus of the series was sacrificed to achieve that end, however. Scripted events made way for player freedom, creating a less constrained experience than most other World War II shooters of the day. The game covers a lot of ground compared with some of the previous entries in the franchise, which often focus on a smaller geographical area. In European Assault, players fight Tiger tanks in North Africa, Nazi forces around Stalingrad, partake in the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium, and even carry out the famous Saint-Nazaire raid in France. The wide variety of prominent battles players could fight in was almost worth the price of admission alone. However, as titles like Battlefield, Call of Duty, and Star Wars Battlefront became increasingly popular, the shooter genre's focus on narrative-driven campaigns shifted towards intense multiplayer battles, and the inclusion of an online mode slowly became a requirement for games such as European Assault. But fans were disappointed to find that it had no multiplayer action on offer, except for a rudimentary 4-player split-screen mode. Despite this, the game did perform well in terms of sales, but its longevity, due to a lack of value beyond the single player, suffered as a result. All in all, European Assault remains a solid entry in the franchise, even if it wasn't a high watermark for the series. But it was clear that, in order to beat the competition, EA LA's next core entry would have to go above and beyond the call. The first full-fledged Medal of Honor game on a handheld, Medal of Honor Heroes, was developed by Team Fusion for the PSP and released in 2006. Harnessing the power of the then cutting-edge PlayStation handheld, Heroes was an honest-to-goodness Medal of Honor experience on the go. However, some compromises were made in the transition to the smaller, more portable device. Rather than the tightly scripted yet non-linear levels of European Assault, Heroes featured a series of repetitive objectives like capturing a flag or gathering some intel. The PSP's somewhat clunky controls also made controlling the game something of a chore, rather than the smooth mouse and keyboard or dual analog controls gamers had grown accustomed to. Still, the game featured an impressive 32-player online multiplayer mode, which was no small feat for a handheld console. Heroes would also receive a sequel, showing there was some merit in the idea of a more bite-sized approach to the franchise. Medal of Honor Vanguard told the tale of the Allied Airborne forces and was released to PlayStation 2 and Wii gamers in 2007. Vanguard showed some promising ideas, as the concept of a game allowing players to take part in sweeping airborne invasions looked good on paper. Unfortunately, Nintendo and Sony's decidedly weaker hardware hurt its chances of telling a compelling story. In addition, by having reused many assets, models, animations, and even music from previous entries in the franchise, Vanguard gave the impression that it was hastily thrown together as EA attempted to gain ground on Nintendo's then-new platform. But a choppy frame rate, unresponsive controls, muddy graphics, and lack of an online multiplayer would prove to be the decisive reasons for the game's lackluster sales performance and its bevy of negative reviews. It was clear at this point that the series needed a breath of fresh air. EA Los Angeles was ready with a jump to a new graphics engine and an interesting new angle with Medal of Honor Airborne. While previous Medal of Honor games had levels featuring men of the 101st as well as the 82nd Airborne Divisions, and the aforementioned Vanguard had a similar approach, this time the paratroopers would get a proper treatment in a high production value campaign dedicated entirely to them. While not the most successful Medal of Honor game EA would ever release, Airborne nonetheless showed some signs of life for the aging series. The game separated itself from other World War II shooters by giving players the ability to paradrop anywhere on the map, allowing them to complete objectives in a free-form fashion. The addition of improved enemy and squad AI made the firefights more evocative and intense than those of preceding entries in the franchise. Airborne finally brought the series up to speed in the presentation department after a few lackluster outings, with the Unreal Engine 3 powering its beautiful graphics. Giacchino returned to compose the soundtrack, which was as good as anything that had come before it and accentuated the game's intense action sequences. While the multiplayer wasn't anything groundbreaking, it did feature an exciting mode where players could para-drop down onto waiting Axis soldiers or else defend against the Allied onslaught. Additional updates expanded Airborne with a number of new maps and an increased player count, among other features. Despite being a fun diversion, the multiplayer didn't provide players with the same hook that could be found in a plethora of the game's contemporaries, and as a result, gamers quickly flocked to other, more addictive online shooters. In the end, Airborne proved to be the right game at the wrong time. At that point, gamers had become exhausted by the World War II setting and were looking for something new. With Call of Duty 3's financial success less than 1 year prior, and Infinity Ward's venture into the modern warfare time period looming on the horizon, it seemed all but certain that EA's once great series was about to be dethroned by Activision once and for all.
Pin down! Come on!
Medal of Honor Heroes 2 attempted to right Vanguard's wrongs by adding a few interesting new mechanisms, game modes, and a number of improvements that helped make it a more interesting package for PSP and Wii owners alike. Released a couple of months after Airborne, Heroes 2 allowed gamers to play in online arenas with 32 players, an especially welcome feature on the Wii, as there was a lack of good online shooters for Nintendo's console at the time. And additions like leaderboards helped the multiplayer mode to gain a solid player base for some time after its release. The game also showed some attempts at creating new experiences, like an on-rails mode for the Wii that took advantage of the system's unique Wiimote pointing control systems, but this proved to be more of a gimmick rather than a full-fledged, worthwhile game mode. Despite some much-needed improvements over the previous Heroes game and Vanguard, Heroes 2 was still very much a by-the-numbers release, and it didn't prove to be enough to save the franchise from its obvious decline. With sagging sales and a clear lack of direction, EA decided to put the series on a short hiatus. In its absence, the Battlefield games slowly started to rise in popularity, with the console-exclusive Bad Company being both a financial and critical success in 2008. EA started to see the potential of the two big-name military shooter franchises, as they would both be able to compete with Call of Duty directly. The company would take advantage of this to deliver annual releases, with one series leapfrogging the other in a yearly fashion. To wipe the slate clean, EA Los Angeles was closed, and its assets were divided between two new companies: Victory Games, a studio where real-time strategy titles such as Command & Conquer would become the main focus, and Danger Close Games, whose team would develop new entries in the Medal of Honor franchise. 2010's Medal of Honor would bring the series from the seemingly black and white era of World War II to the far more morally gray period of modern conflicts in the Middle East. It seemed to be the bold new approach that EA needed to help the series stand toe-to-toe with Call of Duty, which had seen great success with its Modern Warfare series. However, in the months leading up to its release, Medal of Honor became a subject of widespread controversy. Its multiplayer would allow gamers to take up arms against U.S. forces as members of the Taliban, causing a number of politicians, military officials, as well as veterans organizations to protest against its release. EA eventually caved under pressure and changed the faction's name to Opposing Force, but it did little to sway the various branches of the military, who would refuse to sell the game on all their bases across the globe in spite of the publisher's efforts. Loosely based on parts of Operation Anaconda, and more specifically the Battle of Roberts Ridge, the game featured a short single-player story following U.S. forces in Afghanistan. The design philosophy of early Medal of Honor games made a return, with a focus on linear missions and tightly scripted set pieces heavily inspired by real-life events. Although it didn't break the status quo in terms of storytelling, and its predictability undermined the experience for some, the explosive 4-hour-long campaign was a solid attempt nonetheless, and seemed to be moving the franchise in the right direction. But Medal of Honor was really two games in one. While the single-player component was developed by Danger Close on the Unreal 3 engine, the multiplayer was outsourced to DICE and was made using Bad Company 2's engine, Frostbite 1.5. Taking elements from Battlefield, as well as Call of Duty, Medal of Honor's online mode was essentially a hybrid of the two franchises that attempted to cater towards both their respective audiences. It successfully managed to carve out its own niche and attracted a small but loyal following that would continue to play the game for years after its release. Despite the fact that the franchise had been dormant for several years, Medal of Honor sold fairly well, all but guaranteeing EA would continue to capitalize on the game's direction with a sequel.
Medal of Honor Warfighter aims to accomplish a lot more than its predecessor. Developer Danger Close has talked a lot about nailing the authenticity of playing as a Tier 1 super soldier, and how a more human story would show you the cause, effect, and consequences of wartime violence.
Shortly after EA's Medal of Honor reboot met with adequate consumer and critical response, it became clear that a 14th game in the first-person shooter series would be a go.
Though its biggest problem isn't that it wants to be the playable action movie we're so familiar with at this stage. It's that the game marks off the necessary checkboxes without turning them into anything cohesive or even always coherent.
Sorry, got bad news. The single-player stuff in Medal of Honor is just as empty and unoriginal as its upsetting multiplayer.
Warfighter lacks a convincing reason to fight, and there's no reason anyone should pick up the banner apart from brand loyalty or sheer boredom.
Debuting to disappointing sales and mediocre reviews, Medal of Honor Warfighter was the final nail in the coffin for the once groundbreaking series. The game was lambasted for being yet another uninspired middle-of-the-road shooter, with a campaign that failed to deliver a compelling narrative, and a forgettable multiplayer plagued with glitches and bugs even after the Day 1 patch. Despite the bold gamble on the part of EA and signs of life from the 2010 reboot, the Warfighter sequel was a critical and financial disaster, and forced the publisher to face the hard fact that its franchise would need to take a break. All the progress and headway the series had made with the previous installment was brought crumbling to the ground. The legendary series had met its end after 13 years of delighting some gamers and disappointing others. In addition to Warfighter's failure to captivate gamers, EA decided that sucking up precious development resources, pumping out two similar franchises, was no longer sustainable, and chose to focus its efforts on the more successful Battlefield games, making Medal of Honor partially a victim of cannibalization by one of the publisher's more lucrative properties. Danger Close Games ceased to exist as a separate entity in 2013. The company was renamed to DICE Los Angeles and went on to deliver support for DICE Stockholm's games. Rich Hilleman, who was the company's chief creative director at the time, stated that EA was fully at fault for Warfighter's dismal performances. According to him, there was a lack of quality leadership necessary to get the franchise back on the right track. He further noted that the Medal of Honor property will see a return when the time is right, and someone at EA is willing to carry it. Medal of Honor had its moments. It had its ups and downs. Any fan of first-person shooters has felt its effects and fondly remembers Allied Assault's beach invasions, Pacific Assault and Rising Sun's Pearl Harbor sequence, or paradropping behind enemy lines in the exciting and innovative Airborne. From the day Medal of Honor debuted on the PlayStation, it seemed like the franchise would be a mainstay in gaming for years to come. But ultimately, with no clear direction, it flailed and floundered and was unable to continue to capitalize on its momentum. The series that once pioneered the modern first-person shooter formula slowly started to follow suit when rivaling franchises continually outshined Medal of Honor with more interesting and innovative features. The development studio's inadequacy of adapting to the latest FPS trends was a contributing factor to the series' ultimate demise. By the time Medal of Honor caught up with the multiplayer design focus of its competitors, it was already too late. And despite numerous attempts, EA was unable to save the franchise from certain death. It's a sad end for a legendary series that once proved to the world that video games could be so much more than collecting coins and jumping on Goombas. That video games could tell the story of one of humanity's watershed moments in a way that books or movies never could. The medium simply wouldn't be where it is today if it wasn't for DreamWorks Interactive pushing the envelope all the way back in 1999. And there's no question that a majority of today's high-profile first-person shooter franchises owe their success to Medal of Honor. Thank you for watching our video about the rise and fall of Medal of Honor. We hope you enjoyed it. We'd like to thank our patrons for helping us make this possible. If you enjoy our content and would like to see us create more video game documentaries, please consider supporting us on Patreon.